August 1945. The air inside the wooden barrack reeked of sweat, mildew, and rusted metal. Outside, the cicadas screamed against the heavy silence of defeat. I was 22 years old, a civilian clerk conscripted into service near Manila, captured when the front collapsed. They called me a prisoner of war, though I had never carried a weapon. For weeks I sat in the dark, my wrists raw from rope, my stomach gnawing itself empty. The guards who marched us here had vanished after Japan surrendered. We were left behind, abandoned women in a crumbling outpost, waiting for whatever would come next. Rumors circled in whispers. The Americans were advancing, their tanks rolling through Luzon, their planes blotting out the sun. Some women said we would be executed before they arrived. Others said worse, that the enemy would do to us what our own soldiers had done to conquered women. I clutched my knees in the dark, trying to steady my breath. I remembered the words I had once written in a hidden notebook. If death comes, let it be quick. If shame comes, I will not survive it. When the trucks finally appeared, we pressed our faces to the cracks in the walls. The sound of engines rumbled closer, steady and unhurried. Then boots, dozens of them, striking the ground with precision. The door was kicked open, and sunlight burst in like an explosion. I threw up my hands against the glare. Silhouettes filled the frame, tall men in helmets, rifles held ready. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was the moment. One of them shouted in English, words I did not understand, but his tone was commanding, not cruel. Another motioned with his arm. They wanted us out. We shuffled forward, our bodies shaking, expecting blows, expecting hands grabbing. I braced myself for the humiliation I was certain would come, but it did not. The soldiers stepped aside, creating a corridor. They kept their rifles low, their eyes scanning the ruins beyond us, not our faces. One soldier glanced at me briefly, his gaze sharp, then moved on. No one reached for me. No one touched me at all. Outside, the sun blinded me. I stumbled into its heat, the ground hard beneath my bare feet. Around us, the outpost lay in ruins, walls shattered, roofs collapsed, smoke curling in the distance where artillery had fallen days earlier. Civilians lined the road, staring at us, whispering. The Americans kept their distance, forming a protective ring, but never closing in. I waited for hands to seize me, for the nightmare to begin. But the nightmare never came. Instead, a medic approached, his armband marked with the Red Cross. He crouched slightly, his movements slow, as if not to frighten me. He extended a canteen of water. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The liquid was warm, metallic, but as it slid down my throat, I almost sobbed. I had not tasted clean water in weeks. The soldier said something softly, words lost on me, then rose and moved away. I clutched the canteen as if it were armor. I looked at the men surrounding us, dusty, sweat-streaked, but calm. They kept their eyes forward, watching the horizon, scanning the trees. I realized suddenly that their discipline was not for show. They had orders, protect, not prey. The relief that surged through me was almost painful. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling my heart thunder. I whispered to myself words I had never thought I would say. The enemy is not what I was told. And yet, even as I drank again, disbelief gnawed at me. Could this restraint last? Or was it only the beginning of something I had not yet imagined? The march began that same afternoon. They led us out of the outpost in a column, our wrists unbound, our steps unsteady. I expected prods from bayonets, shouts, perhaps kicks to force us forward. None came. The Americans walked beside us, rifles slung casually, eyes sweeping the tree line as though danger lurked everywhere but in us. I kept my gaze on the ground, waiting for the hand that would shove me, waiting for the moment when kindness would turn to cruelty. We passed through villages burned to husks, bamboo huts blackened, roofs collapsed. Civilians watched silently from doorways, their faces hollow from hunger. I heard whispers ripple as we passed. Some words carried my language, others I didn't understand. Shame pressed against my skin. I felt their stares like knives. To them we were not simply defeated, we were disgraced. And yet, the soldiers at our side neither jeered nor pushed. Their silence was heavy, but not cruel. At dusk, we reached a clearing where tents had been pitched in neat rows. A flag with white stars on blue and red stripes flapped in the humid air. My stomach clenched. I had seen that flag only in propaganda posters, painted as the banner of monsters. Now it hung above us, real and undeniable. The soldiers guided us to one side of the camp. There was barbed wire, yes, but it was loosely strung, more symbolic than imprisoning. We collapsed onto the ground, exhausted, waiting for the punishment we believed was coming. Instead, a truck arrived with crates. The sound of metal being pried open rang across the clearing. One by one, they handed us packages, small boxes wrapped in brown paper, stamped with letters I could not read. I tore mine open with shaking fingers. Inside were biscuits, tinned meat, and even a piece of chocolate wrapped in silver. I stared at it in disbelief. Food, not chains. Sustenance, not violation. The woman beside me began to sob as she bit into a biscuit, crumbs spilling down her chin. Another clutched the chocolate to her chest as if it were a jewel. I tasted the meat, salty and rich, and nearly cried from the shock of it. For weeks I had lived on watery gruel and scraps. Now the enemy filled my hands with more than I had seen in months. The Americans did not watch us with hunger in their eyes. They did not laugh at our desperation. They handed out the boxes, then turned back to their duties, as if feeding us was as routine as loading their rifles. I felt dizzy, unmoored. My mind kept circling the same thought. Why aren't they touching us? Why aren't they doing what our soldiers would have done? That night, we were given blankets, coarse but clean. The ground beneath the tent was hard, yet I slept more deeply than I had in months, the sound of distant engines a lullaby compared to the screams and threats I had grown used to. But sleep did not erase doubt. When dawn broke and the camp stirred with the clatter of mess tins and boots, fear returned. Perhaps the restraint had been temporary, a trick to disarm us before the true humiliation began. I tightened my blanket around me, bracing for the worst. Instead, a soldier approached with a pot of coffee. The smell drifted through the air, bitter and warm. He filled our cups without a word, his face tired but calm. When my turn came, his hand did not linger, his eyes did not wander. He poured, nodded once, and moved on. I sipped cautiously, the taste sharp on my tongue, and felt tears sting my eyes. In my notebook, hidden still inside my clothes, I scribbled quickly, "They feed us. They clothe us. They do not touch us. How can this be? Have I been lied to my entire life?" The days stretched into a rhythm. We rose with the bugle, lined up for rations, sat in shade when the sun grew fierce. The Americans kept their distance, speaking among themselves in words that rose and fell like waves. Sometimes one would gesture kindly, showing us how to open a can or light a stove. Once, a medic checked a woman's wounds, bandaging her arm with practiced hands. She flinched at first, certain he would hurt her, but his touch remained clinical, brisk, respectful. I watched all of it in silence, my disbelief deepening with each day. The stories we had been told, about American brutality, about women taken and discarded, did not match the reality unfolding before me. These men did not act like conquerors. They acted like guardians. And yet the question never left me. Why? Why this restraint? Why this discipline? Did they see us as too broken to bother with? Or did they see us as human? At night, when the camp quieted and stars flickered above the palms, I lay awake, listening to their laughter drifting from the other side of the tents. It was not the harsh laughter of men preparing for violence. It was light, almost weary, like brothers remembering home. I thought of my own brother, drafted years earlier, his fate unknown. Perhaps, somewhere far away, a woman like me sat in another camp, guarded by men like him. For the first time since the war began, I wondered if enemies could also be mirrors. The days bled into one another, marked not by fear of violence, but by the slow return of routines I thought were lost forever. At dawn, the bugle called, sharp and clear across the camp, and the American soldiers rose with practiced speed. They lined up, boots polished even in the mud, rifles slung at their shoulders. I watched them with cautious fascination. Discipline held them like invisible chains, but unlike the chains that had bound me, theirs seemed chosen. When our turn came, we lined up in silence, women with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, waiting for the handouts. Mess tins clanged as soldiers filled them with food, sometimes rice, sometimes beans, sometimes meat from a tin. The portions were small, but compared to the scraps we had survived on, it felt like abundance. I still remember the shock of tasting white bread for the first time. Soft, almost sweet, it dissolved on my tongue, like a memory from another world. I chewed slowly, afraid that if I finished too quickly, the dream would end. Not once did they shove us. Not once did they jeer. They handed us food the way one might hand it to family, without hesitation, without cruelty. My eyes searched their faces for hunger, for the telltale signs of men who might take more than they gave. But their gazes slid past us, focused on duty, not desire. The absence of violation was almost harder to believe than the presence of kindness. At first, I suspected strategy. Perhaps they were waiting, wearing masks of discipline until our guard lowered. Perhaps the order to take us as spoils would come later. I slept with my body clenched tight, braced for footsteps outside the tent, for the rough hands I knew too well from stories whispered by women in villages where soldiers had passed. But night after night, the only sounds were the steady tramp of boots on patrol, the murmur of men telling stories to one another in a language I couldn't understand, and sometimes laughter carried by the wind. No screams, no cries, no doors crashing open. One evening, I gathered courage to approach the fence that separated our section from theirs. Beyond it, soldiers sat on crates, smoking cigarettes that glowed like fireflies in the dark. One of them noticed me and raised his hand in greeting. I flinched, expecting a crude gesture, but instead he reached into his pack and tossed something gently across the wire. It landed at my feet with a soft thud, a piece of chocolate, wrapped in silver. My heart pounded as I picked it up. I had never seen such a thing. I unwrapped it slowly, the sweet smell foreign and overwhelming. The taste flooded my mouth, melting bitter and rich. Tears slid down my face before I could stop them. I wanted to ask him why. Why give this to me? Why not take what he could instead? But language was a wall I could not climb, so I pressed my palms together, bowed deeply, and held the wrapper to my chest like a relic. He nodded once, almost solemn, then turned back to his comrades. That single piece of chocolate became proof that the enemy could choose mercy. The contradiction gnawed at me. How could the same nation that dropped the bombs now hand me sweetness? How could hands that gripped rifles also offer blankets, medicine, and food? I had been taught since childhood that Americans were beasts, but what I saw before me were men who treated me with more restraint than some of our own soldiers had shown to women in occupied lands. Days grew warmer. We were allowed to wash at a stream nearby, escorted by guards who looked away respectfully as we bathed. For the first time in years, I felt the grime of fear lift from my skin. My hair clung damp to my shoulders, my reflection in the water unfamiliar. I looked older, thinner, but also alive. Once, as we walked back, I tripped on a stone and nearly fell. An American soldier reached out instinctively, his hand brushing the air near me, but he stopped short, catching my arm only lightly to steady me before pulling back as if scalded. His eyes met mine, blue and distant, but full of something I couldn't name. Respect? Restraint? Pity? Whatever it was, he released me at once and stepped aside. My knees shook, not from fear, but from the shock of being helped without being claimed. That night I wrote in my notebook, I was prepared for cruelty, but not for dignity. I was prepared for violation, but not for distance. Perhaps I never understood what power truly looks like. Some of the other women whispered doubts. They said the Americans looked at us with contempt, that their discipline was only because they saw us as beneath notice, too shamed to desire. Perhaps there was truth in that, yet I preferred contempt to the alternative. I preferred invisibility to the violation I had feared. But not all was mercy. Around us, the war's wreckage loomed. Prisoners of war, men this time, were marched into the camp, their bodies thin as skeletons, their eyes hollow. Some collapsed on the ground, too weak to stand. American medics tended them, just as they tended us, but the sight of such suffering reminded me that compassion could not erase destruction. The war had scarred everyone, on every side. Still, when I lay awake at night, I no longer clenched my body in dread. I listened instead to the distant songs of soldiers, soft and almost tender, as if they sang not for war, but for home. Their voices carried across the camp like threads binding together two worlds I had thought irreconcilable, enemy and protector, conqueror and savior. And slowly I began to believe that maybe the nightmare was not waiting to return. Maybe the miracle was real. The weeks stretched into months, and I remained in that strange place where captivity felt less like a prison and more like a suspended life, floating between shame and survival. Each morning began the same. The sharp call of the bugle, boots striking the gravel in unison, and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the American mess line. Even now, the smell unsettles me. Coffee had never been part of our lives before the war, and in those first mornings it smelled alien, bitter, strong, almost frightening. But soon it became the smell of routine, of something steady when the rest of the world had collapsed. We were prisoners, yet no one barked orders at us in Japanese. No one slapped us across the face if we bowed too slowly. The Americans spoke in English, their words falling like steady rain, unintelligible, but not cruel. Their hands remained on their rifles, on crates, on papers, but never on us. That restraint was louder than any kindness. It was an absence that roared inside my chest. Meals were small miracles. At dawn, we lined up with mess tins, and soldiers ladled food into them without sneering, without gloating. Sometimes beans, sometimes rice, sometimes meat floating in salty broth, and sometimes bread, soft, white bread, unlike anything I had seen since childhood. I remember the first bite, warm, slightly sweet, dissolving in my mouth so quickly I wanted to weep. I chewed slowly, terrified that swallowing too soon would erase it. I caught the eyes of another woman across the line, and she was crying silently as she ate. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We grew accustomed to the rhythm of camp life. We swept the dirt around our tents, washed our clothes in the stream, mended blankets with clumsy stitches. At the stream, we bathed under the watch of soldiers who turned their backs, pretending to be absorbed in the tree line. That act alone stunned me. I had heard too many whispers about what our soldiers had done in China, in Korea, in the Philippines. I had braced my body for the same. Yet these men deliberately looked away, granting us a privacy we had thought impossible. I remember sinking into the cold water, scrubbing the dirt from my arms, and whispering to myself, "They do not even look." Why? One day, while returning from the stream, I stumbled on a stone. My knees buckled, and for a moment I felt myself falling. An American soldier reached out instinctively. His hand brushed my sleeve, steadying me, and then he pulled back at once, as if the touch had burned him. Our eyes met, his blue, mine dark, and for a heartbeat, I saw something I did not expect. Not hunger, not disdain, but recognition. He knew I was fragile. He knew I feared him, and so he withdrew. That single moment unraveled years of lies I had been told about what enemies do. At night, lying beneath my coarse blanket, I listened to their voices. The soldiers gathered around lanterns, singing softly. I could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Homesick, wistful, tender. Some hummed melodies that reminded me of fishermen on the coast of Kyushu, men who sang to the sea as they cast their nets. I thought of my brother, lost somewhere in the war, perhaps dead. Did he once sing by a fire like this, far from home? Did some woman in America, thousands of miles away, fear for her brother too? In that thought, the world shrank until even enemies were bound by the same ache. Still, suspicion never fully left me. Every kindness felt fragile, as though it might shatter without warning. I kept my notebook close, scratching down every detail by lantern light. They feed us. They clothe us. They let us sleep. But why? Do they see us as human? Or as ghosts of an enemy already beaten? The contradictions tore at me. I could not forget the ruins of our cities, the flash of the bomb, the thousands who had perished in fire. How could the same nation that had unleashed such destruction now place chocolate in my hands? I unwrapped one piece slowly, inhaling its sweetness, and wondered if I was betraying the dead by enjoying it. Yet my body, starved for months, demanded that I eat. The guilt was bitter, the chocolate sweet, and together they lodged in my throat until I swallowed with tears. Sometimes the Americans showed us photographs. They carried them tucked inside helmets or pockets. Images of wives in dresses, children on bicycles, houses with painted porches. One soldier showed me a picture of his sister, smiling in front of a garden. He pointed at her, then at me, speaking words I couldn't understand, but I felt their meaning anyway, that across oceans, across uniforms, we were the same. A sister, a daughter, a life interrupted by war. I bowed, unable to hold his gaze for long. There were darker reminders, too. I saw male prisoners marched into camp, emaciated Japanese soldiers, their bones sharp against their uniforms, their eyes blank. They collapsed in the dust, and American medics bent to tend them as they had tended us. That mercy cut me deeply. These were men who had fought to the last, who might have killed Americans without hesitation, and yet here they were being given water, bandages, food. It struck me then that mercy was not weakness. Mercy was power wielded in a different way, and it left scars of gratitude instead of hatred. The day of transfer came sooner than I expected. Trucks rumbled into camp, spewing dust, their backs open for us to climb aboard. My stomach twisted. I braced for rough hands, for shoves, for jeers. Instead, one soldier extended his hand politely as I stepped up, steadying me for a moment before pulling back. My throat ached. Even in this final act, they chose dignity over domination. As the convoy rolled away, I looked back at the camp. Soldiers stood at the gate, rifles at their sides, watching us leave without expression. Dust swirled in the sunlight, blurring their faces. I gripped the edge of the truck and whispered to myself, I prepared for hell. Instead, I was given restraint. We passed through villages half-burned, fields scarred by craters, rivers swollen with rain. Civilians watched us with wary eyes, children clutching their mothers' hands. I felt their gaze, felt the weight of shame press down again. But the Americans did not mock me. They kept their rifles pointed outward, guarding the road, not us. When we reached the release point, there was no ceremony. Papers were signed, names written down, and then the gate opened. We were free. Women wept, clutching one another. Others walked stiffly, unwilling to show relief. I stepped forward slowly, my legs trembling, each step heavy with disbelief. Not once had I been touched. I left with nothing but a wool blanket, a dented tin cup, and the memory of absence. That absence defined me more than anything else. I had prepared for cruelty, for humiliation, for the destruction of what little I still had. Instead, I was left intact. The silence of restraint was louder than any kindness. Years later, when I remember those days, I do not think of the rations or the tents or the trucks. I think of what did not happen. I was a Japanese POW woman, and I was stunned when American soldiers didn't even touch me. That silence changed me more than any act could have. It proved that power does not always have to wound, that sometimes choosing not to act is the act that saves. If my story spoke to you, if it made you feel, reflect, or reconsider, do not let it vanish. Subscribe to this channel, leave your comment, and share your thoughts. Your voice ensures that stories like mine, quiet but vital, continue to echo through time, so the absence of cruelty will be remembered as strongly as its presence.